Oh, this is the best scarf. Well, there's two very good places in Islamabad. Yeah, listen, one of my producers now imports scarves from there because she went so crazy. Right. How it works. Right. Right.
Hello everybody, welcome to the Frontline Club. Thank you for coming to this evening's event that's in association with BBC Arabic. Before I hand over to Rasha Qandel, who's chairing this evening, if I can ask you to switch your phones to silent, and when it comes to questions, if you can wait for the microphone because we are broadcasting live. Over to Rasha.
Hi, good evening everybody, and as you all know, we're here to talk about the book of Lindsey today, Sandstorm. Can you hear now? Is it better? No? Volume? Okay, is it better now? Any better? Anything? No? Is it okay? All right, I'll shout. I just ask you to forgive my cough. I have a stupid cough, so anyway. So we're here tonight to discuss with Lindsey Hilsum, after, of course, welcoming her new book about Libya, Sandstorm, Libya during Revolution. And as far as I understand, you're all here to hear about her experience, her first take on what happened to Libya, why she thinks the revolution has broken out, and where it reached now. So, Lindsey, hi, nice to meet you.
Thank you very much.
And let me first start by Lindsey Hilsum. Who are you? Why did you write that book?
Why did I write the book? Well, I wrote the book partly because of someone who's not here. And that was a Libyan friend of mine called Tariq Ben Halim, who was really the first Libyan I got to know well. And Tariq was a great believer in democracy in the Arab world. And he believed that there was no reason why Arabs shouldn't have democracy just like anybody else. And he tried to do something about that, and he was very frustrated. And I should say at this point that Tariq very sadly died before the Libyan revolution, and there wasn't a day when I didn't wake up in Libya and want to call him and say, what do you think about this? Because he was the person with whom I talked about all these issues, and I should say that Tariq's wife and his brother are here with us tonight, and for that I'm very happy. And so that was the first thing. And then the next thing was I was in Egypt, and then, as you all remember, the revolution started last year, and we got over the border pretty soon, February 23rd. And it was pretty exciting, and it's about as good as it gets as a journalist, you know. It was such fun. You know, things were happening all around us. And also, quite often, as you know, when you're a journalist, people are forever trying to stop you finding things out. These people were desperate for us to find things out. They were just so thrilled to have us there. So there was a huge wave of momentum. And then I saw on the courthouse in Benghazi in the east, where the revolution started, as you all know, in the east, these pictures of men, the martyrs. And so obviously I asked, do you want to come to the front? There's seats here. These pictures of all these men, and I asked who they were. Sam, there's a seat there. And I was told that they were the martyrs of Abu Salim, which was a prison massacre which happened in 1996, which I didn't know about. And Abu Salim was Gaddafi's Halabja. It was as Halabja was to Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And I learned that this was a massacre where 1,270 men had been herded into a courtyard in the prison and gunned down by soldiers around on the roof. So I wanted to find out about that. So I asked if I could meet a couple of families, of relatives. And so we were taken into a room, and there weren't just a couple of families. There were maybe 25, 30 people, women on one side, men on the other, in the Arab way, you know, everybody round the edge of the room. And each of them was holding up a picture of the son, the father, the husband, the uncle who they had lost. And they were completely silent as we walked in. And I knew that this was something very important. And of course I couldn't, doing television, you can't get everybody's story because there's too many people. So I thought, what the hell am I going to do? And so I thought, well, what we'll do is we will get the camera to go round and we will get everybody just to say the name of their person. So at least we acknowledge something, we acknowledge their pain. So we went round and everybody said the name of their person. And then I asked the women to nominate someone and the men to nominate someone to come forward and tell their story. And so this old man came up, little man, stooped, red fez on his head, huge black rimmed glasses. He came up and he said, it was my brother-in-law. And he said, every couple of months for 14 years, I would go to Tripoli, which is 600 miles away, with his wife, in other words, this man's sister, and their 2 children, to take him toiletries and food and whatever he needed. And we were always told, he said, that you can't see him, but leave the stuff with the guards at the gate. And then he said, we did that for 14 years before they told us he was dead. And I was just stunned by that. I was just stunned by the cruelty of that. Because I've been in so many places where people disappear, where people are tortured, where people are killed. But I actually had never been anywhere where they kill your husband and they don't tell you for 14 years. So for 14 years, you live with that glimmer of hope that he will still be alive. And so I think that was what made me want to write the book, because I felt guilty because we had turned Gaddafi into a buffoon, and he was a buffoon. And there are many things in the book which are very funny about Gaddafi because he was nuts. But I felt that we had failed to acknowledge how terrible the regime was. And I think that was something I learned from those people on that day in Benghazi in the first couple of weeks of being in Libya.
I like your introduction, your prologue in the beginning of the book, because you actually set the scene. I got the feeling that it's a novel rather than a book. I don't know if this is good or bad, but I felt that I'm reading it as a novel. And since you started talking about
that was what I was trying to do.
Good. So chapter 1, you started with actually telling the story of Abu Salim, the prison, and why things emerged in Libya that way. But since you mentioned Gaddafi, I have a kind of tough question for you. Didn't you fear that it's going to be like you're a bit ridiculing the guy? Because I know that he came across as the mad clown and some of, some other very harsh descriptions about him. But some people actually quite liked him. And you wrote about some of those people in the early days of the revolution when there was this free officers movement.
Yeah.
You've written about a personal experience of some who used to be back then young officers who were actually in love with the guy. They adored him. So tell me about Gaddafi himself.
No, absolutely. And that's, I think that one of the things about Gaddafi which is so interesting is that when he first came to power in 1969, lots of people did love him. And that was because of the situation Libya was in. And one of the things I've tried to do in the book is tell the story through the eyes of Libyans who I met. And one of the Libyans I met, I don't think it's the person that you're referring to, but another one, I went into the souk in Tripoli, and this was sometime after the revolution, after I'd gone back to start to research the book. So I was just sort of wandering around. And the first guy who you come across in the metal workers souk is an old guy called Mohammed. And he's the one who makes those copper half moons, that you put on the top of minarets. So I got chatting to him because he had an English-speaking friend with him. And he told me about how in 1967, time of the Six-Day War, he was living there and how he was part of the riots where they chased the Jews out of the Medina. And that was what he felt was right at the time. And then in 1969, when Gaddafi came to power, he was thrilled because King Idris, he saw, as being just basically an old fart who was just not doing anything and not modernizing the country. And he looked to Egypt next door and saw Nasser and thought, yeah, that's what we need. We need a strong leader like Nasser. And he thought that Gaddafi was their Nasser, and that was exactly the image that Gaddafi tried to portray. And then, so he was full of enthusiasm, and he went out and he demonstrated for Gaddafi. And then he began to change his mind. I asked him, why did you change your mind? He said, well, I would go home from work, and between where I work in the souk and home, someone would have erected a gibbet on the street, and people would be hanging. And that was a story I heard from many different people who had originally supported Gaddafi. And then he said, there was the day when I was outside of the Medina, but I got a message that my assistant had been seized by someone. So he'd gone rushing back to the Medina, and he too had been seized. And he spent the next 11 years in the army. It was the press gang who just came into the Medina and seized all the young men. So he then goes to Tajikistan. He's trained in Tajikistan. He ends up fighting the world's most stupid war, which is in Chad, where Gaddafi wages war on Chad for the Ouzo Strip, which is a few kilometers of desert. And to tell you something Libya doesn't need, it's a bit more desert. It really doesn't. And there he is fighting this war. And so I realized that the Mohammed story was the story of Libya and the story of Libya's relationship with Gaddafi. And he said to me, we had a couple of conversations. At the end of one of them, he said to me, he said, all my life, journalists have been coming to talk to me because I'm the first guy who you meet when you come into the metalworkers' souk. He said, but I've never been able to tell my story before. This is the first time I've been able to talk freely. So I said, oh, that's lovely. I was sort of basking in the loveliness of that. And then he said, what's the name of that bloke from the BBC, the one with the white hair? I said, John Simpson. He said, I didn't tell him my story. I said, well done.
The personal stories, this is one of the main interests in this book. I actually recommend reading these stories of real people, because I think it's one of the major points about this book is that it's telling the stories by their owners, the story makers, actually, which is quite special. You've written about and you've filmed about Fallujah, about Egypt, about Syria, about many other countries, Israel, the Palestinian territories. Back then, when it was 1 month after the start of the revolution, the Libyan revolution, when you went and you wrote about your first lines in this book, I think, compared to the other countries, especially Tunisia and Egypt, which were almost around the same time that the Libyan revolution has started, which is the most difficult one, you think?
Difficult to cover?
Difficult to cover, yes.
That's an interesting question. I suppose Egypt, because I didn't cover Tunisia, and I think I see Libya as the only true revolution that happened last year, because in Libya, the whole apparatus of the state was overturned. Whereas I see it in Tunisia, basically it was as if Ben Ali had sort of hijacked the apparatus of state for as long as his rule, and now they're sort of going back to something which existed before. And in Egypt, it was really more like a military coup which involved some young people on the streets. So I think in terms of understanding, Libya was actually reasonably straightforward. And so in that way it was also very accessible. I mean, the sort of fighting part of it was very accessible. It's a long time since I've covered a war where they have the grace to have it on the main road. So you can sort of drive up, cover it for a few hours, and then go back to your hotel to send your story. And there's a few people here who were with us who did that. So in terms of, I think Libya was quite simple in that way. I think Egypt was much more complex because I think Egyptian society is much more complex. And then also there's Bahrain. I went to Bahrain very briefly. And of course, poor Bahrain. I think of Bahrain as a sort of Cinderella of revolutions, really. And I mean, quite apart from the coverage, the fact that to many people in the West, it looked like all the other revolutions. It looked like young people on the streets wanting democracy. But of course, in the Gulf, it looks completely different. It looks like Iran, or to the Gulf leaders, they see it as the beginning of instability, which can affect Saudi Arabia and change the balance of power so that Iran gets its talons into the Sunni Gulf area. So that again was a much more complicated one. So I suppose one of the reasons why I chose to write about Libya was because I felt I sort of got it. I kind of understood it. It wasn't that difficult.
You throw a lot of attention on Benghazi, which is basically where you could feel the spirit, if I may say, of the fighters more than Tripoli, at least till the last few weeks. What's the difference? What did you notice, and how does it reflect in your book?
Well, it was very different because I think that the people in Benghazi had hated Gaddafi for a very, very long time. And it's interesting, going back to Benghazi, after I'd been in Tripoli, Paul, sit down. Benghazi is so shabby, it was so neglected. And I remember going, after the revolution back in October, I was wandering along a street in Benghazi. One of the joys about writing a book is that you get the time to wander along a street, which you never do when you work for television. When you work for television, all you're doing is focusing on whatever it is that you're trying to get. So you get what you're trying to get, or you fail to get it. And one of the glories of this thing was I wandered around and I picked up so much stuff just by, drifting around. Anyway, I was drifting around Benghazi. And got chatting to an old guy running a shop, and he started to tell me, there used to be window boxes with flowers here, and the streets were swept, and Benghazi is just a disaster. I mean, it's totally broken down and neglected because the people in the east were seen as supporters of the king and as traditional opponents to Gaddafi. So that was a big difference.
Yeah.
And I think that Gaddafi really tried to emphasize those differences between the different places, Benghazi, Misrata, Tripoli, Nafusa Mountains. And I think that that's part of the problem that we see today, that, we see all these militias from these different places fighting each other and all this rivalry. And I think that a lot of that was sown by Gaddafi.
One of the reviews that really drew my attention was one in Observer and another one in The Guardian. And I like the sentence being written about you. It says, Hilsum's disgust shines through as she recounts how the West embraced Gaddafi. And the contrast, I like the sentence written, Tony Blair embraced Gaddafi and Private Britain delivered up to brother leaders' opponents for imprisonment for torture. How
Well, that's
did that
right.
reflect in your book?
Yeah, because basically, I mean, that's the other fascinating thing about Gaddafi is this sort of zigzag through history, that he starts off as the mad dog of the Middle East, which is what Reagan called him. And, allegedly and probably responsible for Lockerbie, certainly for many other terrorist acts, supplying the IRA with weapons. And then after 9/11, he becomes our new best friend, because Gaddafi wanted to rehabilitate himself internationally, and he and our enemy's enemy is our friend. And so, because the opponents to Gaddafi by then were jihadis, were people who were in Afghanistan, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, they were not actually part of Al-Qaeda. They never became part of Al-Qaeda, and they never blew up Westerners or anything like that, but they definitely moved in the same circles as Al-Qaeda, and they were there in Afghanistan. And Sami al-Sadi, I'm going to read a bit about Sami al-Sadi in a minute. He was one of the main people in the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, and he knew bin Laden very well and spent time with bin Laden, and he knew Mullah Omar. So, but his only desire was to overthrow Gaddafi. But you can see why, from the outside, to MI6 and CIA, this man looks like, he's the same enemy. And then you have this very intriguing character, Musa Kusa, who you may remember. Musa Kusa, in Libya they call Musa Kusa Gaddafi's black box. He knows everything. And he had been the head of the Libyan People's Bureau here at the time that Yvonne Fletcher was killed, the police constable. He was involved in the arming of the IRA. He had gone back and headed the Mathaba, which was the center against, I'm going to get this wrong, it's the center against imperialism, Zionism, fascism, colonialism, and there's another ism which I've forgotten. Anyway, they were against it all. He was the head of that, which was which was a training place for people like Charles Taylor. We may come back to Charles Taylor, since today Charles Taylor was condemned to however many years in prison. And so the British and the Americans began to work very closely with Musa Kusa. So I'm just going to read a short passage, if that's all right. Which is, Sami al-Sadi he had fled Afghanistan after 9/11 because he knew that they would come for him, and he had this incredible journey through Iran, Pakistan, Malaysia, and he'd ended up in Guangzhou in southeastern China, decided to become a merchant. And he had then gone to Hong Kong, and that's where he was picked up. Sami was taken to a plane and told he would be sent back to mainland China. The plane never took off, and he was returned to the terminal for a few more days. The night before I was finally taken, I could hear the guards talking Chinese as I lay on the chairs, he recalled. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but I heard them mention CIA 4 or 5 times. Karima, his wife, and the children were brought to the airport. The Hong Kong police again told the family that they were being flown to mainland China, but when they reached the tarmac, they found an Egyptian plane and 4 Libyan security officers, easily recognized by their accents. Sami began to shout, and the police handcuffed him and Karima together and bundled them onto the aircraft. My wife was crying, my children were crying, he recalls. The officers seemed worried about my health because I'm a diabetic, but that wasn't for humanitarian reasons, it was because they wanted me alive. As they landed in Tripoli, they were hooded. Karima thought they were going to be executed, but they were taken to the external security headquarters in the Tripoli suburb of Tajura and put in separate cells. It wasn't long before Musa Kusa arrived. Sami said, he introduced himself and said, Sami, the world has become very small since 9/11. Before, we couldn't arrest you in many countries, but now I can call the CIA or MI6 directly and get all the most recent information on you and your group. At first, Sami's treatment was good, but after a month it deteriorated. They used electric shocks with a baton and beat me on my hands, legs, and the soles of my feet with a wooden stick. They insulted me and threatened to hang me. Karima was also detained, but in a separate room. They insinuated that my wife was not safe. They asked him about Libyan Islamic fighting group members in Libya, and when he didn't cooperate, beat him more. After about a week, 2 Americans, a man and a woman, came to see Sami. They asked him a lot of questions about the Libyan Islamic fighting group and about bin Laden. I think the CIA knew we weren't involved with Al-Qaeda because most people in Kabul knew that we were a separate organization, he said. 6 months later, a team of 5 Americans came and asked similar questions. After a few more months, the British officials turned up. Again, it was a lady and a man, recalled Sami. I don't think it was a real inquiry. They just wanted to know my situation. But I couldn't tell them because there was a Libyan there and his eyes were on my face all the time. If the visitors were very clever, they knew, but I couldn't give a clear indication. The British, he said, discussed how to help face terrorism in the world. They never returned. Sami seems to have become a regular for the intelligence agencies. The Italians were very polite, he says. They asked if I knew anything about Al-Qaeda in Italy and Iraq. Then there were the French. Although maybe they were Canadian, I don't know. I just know that they spoke French. Karima and the children, to Sami's relief, were released after 2 months. Sami spent more than 2 years in prison in Tajura before they came to move him, but any hopes of release were quickly dashed. They took him to Abu Salim, where his brothers had been killed in the 1996 massacre. He despaired that he would ever get out. So that's rendition for you.
That's one of the stories. As an insider, I was actually astonished that you could write like an insider about those guys. One other guy that I think you mentioned like 5 times in your book was Abdullah Sanusi, which is the ex-intelligent head of Gaddafi's regime, and who's now captured in Mauritania, and they refused to deliver him to Libya for a trial. What do you think of trials? If you're going to write another book about the ex-officials of Gaddafi's regime, how are you going to start? Write me a paragraph.
Oh, God. I write you a paragraph. Abdullah Sanusi thought that they would never catch him, I suppose would be the start. Yeah, I mean, it's a mafia. You know, in the end, it was a mafia. Gaddafi, you know, had his weird philosophy, which he wrote in the Green Book, which was a combination of sort of old-fashioned socialism and then his own strange ideas. There's one bit where he talks about women, and he says something like, "Men and women are both human beings." Oh, good, I thought. But sort of that was where it started, and the whole kind of anti-imperialist thing. But by the end, it was just a family mafia. It was him, his sons, and Abdullah Sanusi, who was his brother-in-law, and who is responsible, or many people say he is responsible, for the massacre at Abu Salim. And one of the people who I feature in the book, Wanis al-Asawi, I met Wanis when I went back to Abu Salim after the revolution and to look at the prison, and I just met this guy there. In fact, the team I was working with found him and then came up to me and said, you must talk to this guy. And when he spoke English, and he had been in Abu Salim prison for 19 years. He spent 19 years in prison after being caught after a failed coup attempt in 1984, and he was an eyewitness to the massacre. And I think that one of the things about the book is I think I have the first complete account of what really happened at Abu Salim. And from his cell, which was high up, Wanis saw Abdullah Sanusi as he came into the prison. And this is a very interesting detail which I don't understand. Maybe I'll never understand it. Because Abdullah Sanusi is the one who gave the order to fire. But before that, there was a car there, and Wanis says that Abdullah Sanusi hit the car and said, "No, no, no, not killing, not killing." But then he gave the order. So that is the intriguing thing. Why did he say that? What order had he got? There was only one person higher than Abdullah Sanusi, that was Gaddafi. Had he got this was before mobile phones, Gaddafi wasn't ringing him and telling him to do it. So this is one of the mysteries which is uncovered. Where should Abdullah Sanusi be tried? The International Criminal Court want Abdullah Sanusi because he was in Benghazi at the beginning of the revolution and is allegedly responsible for some of the killings of people last February when they first started to protest in the streets. And so that's why the International Criminal Court want him. But if the International Criminal Court have him, then he will never be questioned about Abu Salim and about other things that went on in the 42 years of Gaddafi's rule. So I totally understand why Libyans want him tried in Libya. But Libya has no institutions. Gaddafi didn't believe in the state. He didn't believe in institutions. He ruled through his revolutionary committees, which were basically the neighborhood thugs. So there is no proper judicial system. And the idea that any time within the next few months, few years, that you can have a proper trial of somebody like Abdullah Sanusi or Saif al-Islam, I find that very hard. And of course the desire for revenge is massive. We know what happened to Gaddafi. There are many people who would like to do to Sanusi and to Saif exactly what they did to Gaddafi himself. So I as usual with these things, I don't have an answer. I don't know what the best thing to do is.
Right, before I open the door for rich questions, I'm sure there is a point of critique from some critics.
Yes, some critics.
There is praise. Which one do you want first?
Oh, go on. Give me the bad stuff.
All right. Your take about the NATO mission. Some people see it as defending the NATO mission without really paying attention to the price that they probably now started claiming, which is Libya's oil. So how do you...
Yeah, no, I think I explained in one chapter that Western countries they had a dilemma, right? They had a number of dilemmas, right? But the dilemma was, okay, you don't intervene, you don't do anything. And then I defy anyone who was in Benghazi that week to think that Gaddafi would not have come in and killed tens of thousands of people. Because one of it is a fact that the Libyan rebels were the most crap guerrilla army that I have ever come across. They were rubbish. And, you know, you all saw it on television, firing into the air. You know, I remember coming across one chap with a mortar tube, and he came up to me, he said, "Madam, a bit is missing from my weapon." I said, "I'm terribly sorry, which bit would that be?" He said, "I don't know." I said, "Well, what are you going to do?" And he said, "Well, I think maybe I have to wait until the bit arrives." I said, "Well, maybe you do." And I said, "How old are you?" He said, 17. And then I heard myself saying, "Does your mother know you're here?" And he said, "She's very proud of me." I said, "Well, she won't be proud of you if you go into battle with a weapon like that." So they were terrible. And I don't have any doubt that Gaddafi would have swept back into Benghazi. That hundreds of thousands of people would have fled to Egypt. And, you know, there would have been a huge number of deaths. But obviously it's a calculation. It's always a calculation, and it's a cynical calculation. And I think part of the cynical calculation was that the Gulf countries, they wanted rid of Gaddafi. Gaddafi had this really annoying habit of trying to assassinate Gulf leaders, especially the kings and princes of Saudi Arabia. They didn't like that. And that's one of the main reasons why the Arab League passed the resolution against Gaddafi. But I also think that I have no evidence that this was a deal which was done, but I think implicit in that was that the Gulf states were supporting NATO to intervene in Libya, and the quid pro quo was, you leave us to deal with Bahrain. And the day that the UN Security Council resolution passed, which permitted intervention in Libya, was the day that the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, including Saudi Arabia, went over the causeway into Bahrain and put down the uprising there. So I think that the people of Bahrain, or the Shias of Bahrain, have paid the price for freedom in Libya. And yes, there's no question that they want Libya for the oil. And, you know, that was another reason why they were interested. I think that they were aware that there would be, you know, another Rwanda, another Srebrenica. I think that they believed that there would be another Rwanda or Srebrenica in Benghazi, and that was one reason for getting involved. But yes, of course, they wanted Libya as an ally, but I don't think they would have done it without the Arab League. In fact, I'm sure they wouldn't have done it without the Arab League involvement. And the last thing is about the number of casualties. There were casualties from the NATO strikes, but I have to say, having reported Kosovo and Iraq, I think there were far fewer casualties on this one. And on the day after the first strikes, which were by the French, on a column of tanks just outside Benghazi, it was pretty amazing. There were missiles that come into the tanks, and so there were like craters within the tanks, and the area around, there was nothing. The grass was exactly the same as ever it was. By the time I got there were children climbing all over everywhere. It was fine, but there were no craters. I mean, the accuracy was absolutely extraordinary, which doesn't mean that there weren't mistakes made and people were killed. There were mistakes made, people were killed. NATO did not own up to all of those mistakes. They refused to investigate some of those things. All of that is wrong. But I think that I have to say that I thought that the bombing was pretty accurate.
Do you want to hear about the good stuff?
Oh, yes, please.
The sense of humor. I think this is like one of the main lines in every review that I've read about the book, and the first thing that I've noticed about the book when I read it is the sense of humor. There is one phrase that I'm afraid I'm going to, you know, like nip in and tell you about, which was amazing. She was telling about Al-Saidi Gaddafi, which is one of Gaddafi's sons, and he's a footballer playing for an Italian club. And then she said that it's a very special case, because this is the only case that one of the players is actually paying the team.
Yeah, so the other way around, because he was really rubbish. But I think that was also because the Libyans have a great sense of humour. And I mean, two things. I mean, one, and some of you who've heard me talk before will have heard this line before, but I still love it, which was one of the graffiti, which I really liked in Benghazi, which I asked people to translate. It said, "Gaddafi, you are the weakest link. Goodbye." And one of the reasons I loved that, apart from the fact it was funny, was also because it actually told you something, because it told you that these were people who were connected to the outside world. They weren't sitting around reading the stupid green book. They were like everybody else. They're watching reality TV and quiz shows. And then, can I read another passage?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, I'm just going to read a passage and this is because I think this is something which shows you about the wit of the Libyans. This is a group of young people, mainly from the same family, who were in Tripoli, and they didn't want to take up arms, but they wanted to show their opposition to Gaddafi. So they started a very daring campaign of civil disobedience, for which, if they'd been caught for any of this, I mean, and one of them was caught at the end, and only just got away with it. But this was the stunt which I liked the most. One day in May, the rubbish began to sing. People walked past, some staring, others hurrying on. It was so loud, people driving past could hear. Curious, they slowed down and then accelerated, fearful that Gaddafi's spies had spotted them, because the pile of black plastic bags on the street corner in the genteel suburb of Fashloum was singing the national anthem, written at independence in 1951, banned by Gaddafi, and subsequently adopted as the theme tune of the uprising. We will never go back to fetters. We have been liberated, sang the rubbish. And we have freed our homeland, Libya, Libya, Libya. It was a free generation movement stunt. Nizar, the oral surgeon from Cardiff, and his sister Mervat had started a campaign of civil disobedience, an attempt to show the regime in non-violent ways that the people were not with Gaddafi. They had recorded 10 minutes of silence, followed by the anthem played multiple times, then uploaded the recording onto 4 sound systems, which they had placed in black plastic bags. On Thursday, the day everyone in Fashloum carried their garbage out onto the street for collection, Niz put out the bags like everyone else and quickly drove off. By the time the music started to play, he was long gone, and no one could know who had brought which bag. Mervat felt nervous that morning. She found herself thinking back to when she was 15, coming into the living room as the TV was showing the hanging of Sadiq Shwedi, the young man accused of plotting against Gaddafi, who was finished off by a fanatical Gaddafi supporter, Huda Ben Ammar, swinging on his legs. She could still hear him screaming. She banished the memory, got into her car, and parked opposite one of the rubbish bags, carefully placing a small video camera inside a tissue box with a hole cut in it for the lens. It was amazing, she said. I could see people were singing along. The shops put down their shutters. A kid shouted, "It's in the trash." And a truck came to pick it up, but someone else shouted, "Put it back." So the man put it back again. Mervat reversed into a side street and adjusted the camera. People hadn't heard the anthem for 42 years. Playing it, even humming it, could get you sent to Abu Salim. Eventually, the soldiers figured out where the music was coming from and picked up the bags of rubbish. But by then, the point had been made. Tripoli was not all with Gaddafi, as he proclaimed. Opposition could spring up anywhere, and they couldn't control it. Mervat drove off. That evening, she showed her husband the video. "That's our car," he said. "I recognize the dashboard. You filmed it, didn't you?" She confessed that she had. He knew there was no way he could stop her now. "I had lost my fear," she said. "I think it was because I knew all those young men were paying with their lives, and I hadn't been able to do anything for 42 years. So that's another thing in the book, is when I was there covering for television, it looked like a very male revolution, because it was all that stuff on the road. But when I went back to research for the book, I found out all these things that women had been doing behind the scenes that I hadn't known about. And that's one of the issues now, which is what role women are going to play in Libya, because, of course, as happens in all revolutions, women play a part and then they get told to get back in their box afterwards. And what Mervat says is, she says, the men say that we don't have the experience to go into politics. And she said, you know what? They don't have the experience either. We've all been living under dictatorship for 42 years. They've got no more experience than we have. But, of course, that's always a fraught issue, and it will be a fraught issue.
Yeah. Well, you thought my questions would be hard.
Yeah, they're going to
wait for that. The gentleman, please.
Ahmed al-Shaybani, a cyber rebel and the founder of the first political party post-Gaddafi revolution, the 17th of February, to overthrow his regime. My question will focus on two areas. The first one, the fact that as a cyber platform, we focused on the Anger Day on the 17th of February, but we only operate from our air-conditioned salons. Yet Libyan women chose to come out not on the 17th because they are hot-blooded. They came out on the 15th and on the 16th in Benghazi.
They came out on the 15th because, let me just tell people, because the lawyer for the Abu Salim families, Fatih Tervil, was arrested on the 15th. And so the revolution was supposed to start on the 17th, but the relatives, who are mainly women and mainly elderly women, came out on the 15th to protest about Fatih Tervil being arrested. And even the Libyan government, I sort of thought twice about mowing down, 30, 70-year-old women. And then what happened was in the next couple of days, more and more people came out. And so then the 17th, which was the day, as you say, when the revolution officially started, everybody in Benghazi and Tobruk and Baydar or in the east came out. But as you say, the women had been there before. Sorry, yeah, go on.
Sadly, we do not see any role for Libyan women, especially now in the transition government. And in memory of the late crusader for freedom and democracy, the Libyan one, and that's the late Tariq bin Halim. We also view Mohammed Bouazizi as the spark for this avalanche. We don't see it as an event, but we see it as a beginning of a process that will ultimately liberate Mecca and Qum from the clamps of dictatorship.
You're going a long way ahead here, but anyway, do go briefly, I think. But I feel we're far into the future here.
But what is your intake on the very cash-rich governments and their affiliate institutions that are conspiring against the Arab Spring and to switch it from military dictatorship to religious dictatorship?
You mean in Libya?
No, Egypt, Tunisia, the Brotherhood cult,
namely,
I mean, Qatar and Saudi Arabia.
The fingers here, are pointing to the Gulf countries.
Gulf countries, okay.
Gulf countries.
Yeah, I think it's a big issue. I think that the role of Qatar is one of the complicated things about this, and I go into it as much as I can in the book, and I wouldn't say that I completely understand it. But yes, Qatar funded the revolution. Qatar clearly supports some people in Libya, particularly Belhaj and Sami al-Sadi, who I've already read to you about, who are, the more fundamentalist, Salafi-oriented Islamist trend. I wouldn't be able to understand entirely what their motivation is, but I do know that this is a sort of big division, I think, within Libya between secular and Islamist. And I suppose the other thing I think, I was very interested that yesterday the interim government in Libya passed a new election law which bans parties based on tribe, ethnicity or religion, which is very interesting because, of course, parties are coming up which are based on religion. I suspect that they'll get round that because the Muslim Brotherhood will call themselves the Dignity Party or something like that, But it's a very real division. But I also think that Western countries cannot do what they did in Gaza. I mean, I was in Gaza when Hamas won the election. And that election was not bad. It was reasonably honest. And they won because people in Gaza saw Fatah as corrupt and saw Hamas as the people who helped them and did charity work and so on. And the West supported that election. And then when they didn't like the result, said, no, you can't have that lot. And you cannot do that. You cannot do that. And so we may have to swallow 3 times in the West if an Islamist government comes to power and put up with it. Because in the end, it's up to the Libyans. And if the secular parties do not get their act together and unite and to make a proper political party that works, and the Islamists do, What are you going to do about it? I mean, it's up to Libyans. I do feel that it's not for the West to intervene in this at this point. That is for Libyans to decide.
Yeah. Gentlemen, please.
Jeff Hill, The Washington Times, Johannesburg. No, I don't need. If I have a microphone, I'll deafen everybody. It's being
For the
broadcast.
broadcast,
Okay,
yeah.
okay, I'll talk quietly. Jeff Hill, The Washington Times. I have read your book, and I love it. But can you tell me, in my home country of Zimbabwe, I'm now based in Johannesburg,
All right.
there were massive investments, not by Libya, but by Gaddafi.
Oh, yeah.
And I found this in other places across Africa as well.
Definitely.
How determined are the new regime to claw back the money, number one? And number two, did you find any evidence of criminal activity with the Italian links, with the Italian mafia? Certainly that's coming to the fore in Tunisia at the moment. But are they determined to get back the money, and how might they? And do you see any criminal links there?
The mafia links I don't know about. There may well be, but it wasn't a thing I investigated. On Africa, I haven't. There's a lot of resentment about money which was spent in Africa amongst Libyans. And that's partly with good reason because of money being wasted, and it's partly racism because there's a lot of Libyans who I've met are very racist about Africa and sub-Saharan Africa and don't see themselves as Africans in any way, see themselves as something different. And that's an argument I've had with many Libyans. I haven't heard of efforts to try and claw back money, and I'm not sure how easy that would be. I mean, one of the instances I have in the book is a young woman called Rasha Qandel. That's actually not her real name, but she was very high up in the foreign ministry and an assistant to the women in the family. And she used to go with Gaddafi all over Africa. And she told me a story of how he once gave her $1 million in cash to spend in the market in Bamako in Mali. You can't possibly spend $1 million in the market in Bamako. I mean, you know, you'd buy every ear of corn and every bottle with a dried snake in it. You know, it was completely impossible, but this was it to give to people. So, you know, that kind of money, you're never going to get that back. That was just kind of handed out in a completely crazy way. And the other thing, sadly, you're not going to get back is all the weapons that he gave to the Tuareg, which they are now using in Mali, and that's why there's been a coup in Mali, because of the Tuareg uprising is suddenly incredibly well armed because they've gone over the border with all the weapons that Gaddafi gave them. So I haven't heard of any effort to try and claw money back, and I suspect that as long as the oil price is high, the new government will make more effort to try and to build things up and go forward, because I think that they probably realise that trying to get money back out of Africa is probably a bit pointless, frankly. But whether they'll try and get back those lovely game lodges and so on that Gaddafi brought in Zim, I don't know.
That's about the Libyan money. What about the diplomacy? Because we know that Gaddafi almost turned his back to the Arabs and looked forward so much to Africa, and he was called the King of Kings in Africa. And not all the interim council will go the same way?
No, I don't. I think that they'll be very against that. But not everybody thinks that was bad. And one of the people who I talked to, is in the book, is a guy called Haji Habib Kagimu, who's a very wealthy businessman in Uganda and a very close friend of Gaddafi's, and who tried to guide Gaddafi and to try and get him to put money into good investments in Africa. And I think that one shouldn't make the mistake of saying that, you know, absolutely everything was terrible and disastrous, because he did put money into Africa, and he did, you know, give people money in Africa, which is not always a totally bad thing. He did also, you know, train Charles Taylor and Foday Sanko, who went off chopping off the limbs of children and so on, which was not so great. But you know, I think what you know, when you talk to people in Africa, and I talked to a couple of people in the African Union as well. You know, he put a lot of money into the African Union, and it's not entirely a bad thing. In some ways, it does help, and it does, you know, under the African Union, they try and sort out problems, and they try and sort out conflicts within states and so on in Africa. So, but the next government, or the current government, I think will not give a toss about Africa, and I think they will totally reject it, because they will want to relate to the Gulf and to Europe.
Lady. I can't remember his name, but the spokesperson for Gaddafi who had been doing
What's his name? Musa Ibrahim, the spokesperson. Yes.
First of all, I wondered what had happened to him.
So do I.
And secondly, I'd be really interested to know, because he had obviously been educated over here, and there was an interesting piece by, I think someone who'd been overseeing his PhD.
His tutor, I know
and
his
who'd
tutor.
become very friendly with him and his family.
That's right.
Who had no inclination that he would go back and support Gaddafi. Why do you think someone like him, who has been educated over here and seen a form of democracy over here, why do you think he then went back and supported Gaddafi?
Can you answer this in one word?
Family.
That's it.
He was from Gaddafi's family. And family, as this other woman who I talked to and got to know, who was a big supporter, we are a family country, she said. That's it.
I have in this room a very big fan of Godfather. Do you think that it can be applied on Gaddafi's regime? The Godfather philosophy.
Yeah, absolutely. He was the Godfather, and it was a mafia, absolutely. And you know, in any regime, there are people who benefit. There are always people who benefit. And the people who benefited supported him up until the moment when they thought that it would benefit them no longer.
The gentleman.
Philip Kenrick. I'm an archaeologist. I've been working in Libya on and off for the last 40 years.
Oh,
so
fantastic.
I've seen quite a long period of change. There are a couple of points.
Can I just say something, which is, because for those who don't know, Libya has the most fantastic archaeological sites that you can imagine, the Greco-Roman cities, Cyrene and Leptis Magna, which I'm very lucky to have seen. So you're very lucky to have spent all that time there.
Absolutely, absolutely. Two observations I wanted to make very quickly. One is about the Al-Qaeda fantasy, a card which Gaddafi played so successfully against Britain and the US, and got their friendship on the basis that he was hostile to Al-Qaeda, and that Al-Qaeda was fighting against him, particularly in Derna in the east.
Yes.
A week ago, I was having lunch in Derna with an old friend of mine who's lived there all his life, and he said this was sheer invention all along. There was never a strong Islamic opposition to Gaddafi in Derna. There was opposition, but it was not particularly religious. But what the young people there found was that they were repeatedly beaten up, thrown in jail, let out again, then very soon beaten up, thrown back in jail. And they left because they were demonized. They went off to Iraq and Afghanistan because there was practically nothing else they could do. Now, that is, it's one person's perspective. It may be no truer than any other, but I suspect there's a lot of truth in it. And that this particular religious extremism was never the danger that it was made out to be. The other point I wanted to make very briefly was the way that Tripolitania and Cyrenaica have consistently behaved in different ways in the 20th century. When the Italians invaded
The
in
East and the West.
in 1911, it was Cyrenaica which resisted them so vigorously for so long until the 1930s, when Tripolitania had already basically reconciled itself to what was going on. And likewise in the Second World War, it was the Senussi army, it was the people of Cyrenaica who actually fought alongside the British. And there are many Libyan veterans who fought with the British and who are not recognized or haven't been. Whereas, again, Tripolitania rather sort of stood aside and didn't play anything like such an active role. And those differences of approach to their own politics and to external politics are still going to bedevil them in the time
I think you're absolutely right about the differences between East and West. I don't completely agree with you about Derna and the Al-Qaeda issue, because although I agree with you, I don't think Al-Qaeda was a threat in itself. I think that the only outlet for people who wanted to oppose Gaddafi was through being jihadi. And I think that many of them did come to believe that. You can argue that they were driven into it. That's fine, but that is where they went. And there are jihadis, and there are Salafists who went round and smashed up the Commonwealth war graves in Benghazi about a month ago. And there are others, who are going around smashing up Sufi shrines. And so, I do believe that there is a jihadi streak that is there. What we don't know is what will happen to that, whether it will grow, whether it will be suppressed or whatever. But there is quite a lot of evidence that Derna, which is a particular town in the east of the country, which supplied the second largest number of jihadi fighters in Iraq after Saudi Arabia, the people fighting, with Saddam, that they believe that stuff. They really do.
Extremism in Libya, then.
It exists. There's no question.
It does exist. But then, what difference did you touch in Libyan extremism? Different from the other countries that you visited?
Well, I mean, the extremism in Libya that I came across or understood was that the jihad was very much against Gaddafi. And I didn't come across anybody whose jihad was against the West as such. But, when it comes to women and the form of government and so on, I think there's a lot of people who do espouse, a fairly extreme Salafi form of Islam. But, I don't know how many or whatever. I have no way of knowing or what will happen with that.
Yeah, but some think that the new interim council
is
actually going towards the Islamic model of regime.
Well, I mean, that's one of the dilemmas, and that's one of the big debates which is going on now. Ed Vuliami wants to ask a question.
I like the term, zigzag.
Yes.
2 questions. I mean, it wasn't really Gaddafi's zigzag, it was Britain's, and America's too, but I want to ask about Britain. I mean, first thing in your answer was largely about Al-Qaeda and ideological, but there is the O word, oil, tens of thousands of Brits, the BP deal, that suddenly caused a bit of a press pause on the war on terror for Mr. Blair. That zigzag, quite spectacular from Blair to what happened later. 2 questions really related. One, what happened to the documentary evidence in Libya of all that? When talking of zigzags, Gaddafi's friend Blair unseated Saddam, we had quite a field day journalistically in terms of the people who call themselves intelligence, wrongly. They enjoyed what they were finding in the filing cabinets. Where is the, for us in Britain, quite interesting story of the zigzag from our point of view of what was actually going on in terms of not just releasing the bomber, but the whole politics of the zigzag. And that's the first question, which is sort of a wider question, really, which is that we love this term revolution when it's against somebody we don't like at the moment. Blair would not have used the term revolution at the time he had his tongue down Gaddafi's throat. We loved it in Eastern Europe, but actually what it meant was, hey, we can get the corporations in. So my second question is this actually a revolution at all for the Libyan people?
Very good. On the documents, I mean, there were quite a lot of documents. There was a whole stash of documents which Human Rights Watch found in the intelligence buildings in the last few days of August, which have been very widely distributed, and we've all reported them, and I used some of them in the book. There were some documents in the British Embassy because the ambassador failed to shred anything before leaving. And I think that there may be more documents that come out. I mean, there have been incredibly embarrassing documents, as you will have seen. I mean, which your paper, The Guardian, has reported on, like everybody else, with the key person in MI6, Mark Allen, writing to his friend, Musa Kusa, and, in the most, well, I wouldn't say intimate, but definitely friendly terms. Was it a real revolution? Yes. I have absolute... The consequences are that the British government, will be much more careful about what it writes down, I would say. And I think every government is going to become increasingly conscious of what gets written down. I think that we're going to move into an age where things get shredded very, very quickly, and where, computers will come up where people remove things very... almost immediately, because in the era of WikiLeaks and so on, They're not going to change their policies. They're just going to try and make sure that we don't see it.
Did you?
No.
Did you get any remarks from any officials here in the UK about your book or any that what you?
Well, I tried. Okay, I should put this. I tried to get interviews, and I was told, and nobody would talk to me. Certainly, how should I put this? Okay, I have certainly spoken to officials here, but very key officials wouldn't talk to me because there are two outstanding court cases. Belhaj and Sami al-Sadi are suing the British government. So that meant that people here were not willing to talk to me. So I have talked to some people off the record, but I didn't really get cooperation of the British government. But I wasn't really trying, to be honest, I didn't try that hard because that really wasn't the focus of what I was doing. And in terms of whether it's a real revolution, yeah, I think it's a real revolution. I have absolutely no doubt that it's a real revolution. And it's a real, if you define a revolution with the order being totally, bouleversé, that's exactly what happens. I mean, there's not a shred of what Gaddafi had as a structure remaining. And I think that the NATO countries, piggybacked on that, and I think that they definitely wanted the oil, and I think they definitely want their corporations in there. And Tripoli now is full of ExxonMobil and oil people, but they were all there before under Gaddafi, but they're back now, and construction companies and so on, because there's a possibility it's a rich place of it becoming the next Dubai. So they're in there like long dogs, but that doesn't mean that it wasn't a revolution started by the Libyans. It was. It really was.
Okay, the lady.
First of all, Lindsey, as a woman, I'd like to say how I admire you for your courage. And no other conflict, with not just Libya, but all over the Arab Spring, have I seen the proliferation of women correspondents reporting from.
We're all out there.
Yeah, it's been wonderful, and I really think you deserve a round of applause for your.
Thank you, Mercedes.
My question is, isn't Saif al-Islam also a black box? I mean, he's been kind of suppressed. We don't hear anything about him. Like there's a news blackout. Is it because the West are afraid that if he is allowed to go to the international court, that he might spill the beans? Or is it really, truly that the Libyans want to try him in Libya?
I don't know how much Saif al-Islam knows, and it's a very interesting point. I really don't know. I mean, I think that Saif al-Islam has become a bit of a bargaining chip, and the people in Zintan, want to keep him there because Libya is such a divided place with the different towns rivaling, with rivalry against each other. And so the Zintan boys who captured him really don't want to surrender him, because as long as they've got him, they can use him to get whatever it is that they want from Tripoli. And I think that they also have a genuine fear that if he goes to Tripoli, that somehow he'll be sprung, and that's not stupid, because that might happen. The interim government says that they're going to try him before June. I just can't. You see how they can do that? You don't have a proper functioning justice system, and if they try and do that, I think it'll be chaos. I'm sure that the Western governments are very nervous about him going on trial of the International Criminal Court, because he was, of course, one of the main people who they dealt with. And in terms of the deal in the desert with Blair and so on, then Saif al-Gaddafi was a key person. And, in his relationship with, Prince Andrew, Peter Mandelson, you name it, relationship, going to the same parties. You can't sort of say that they knew him intimately, but they moved in the same circles, Nat Rothschild, that whole lot. So I'm sure that they don't want him up there. But I'm actually not sure that he is the one who really knows what his father was doing and what was going on in his father's head, because increasingly over time he was somewhat alienated, and his father moved towards his great rival, which was Mutassim, who was the hardline son.
Didn't he claim he wants his money back from Sarkozy?
Oh, yeah, he claims he says he gave money to Sarkozy for his election campaign. Who knows whether that's true or not?
Yeah, but then the comments about France interference in
Yeah.
the ex-officials, Libyan people, is actually going more for Abdullah Sanusi, your guy again, because some voices I heard are saying that France is actually pushing for Abdullah Sanusi not to be delivered to Libya for exactly the same reason.
It's because there was a flight, apart from Lockerbie, there was another flight, which was the UTA flight, which was brought down over West Africa. And that's a French airline, and I can't remember how many French people were killed on board, but many. And Abdullah Sanusi has already been tried and convicted in absentia in France of responsibility for that act of terrorism and for bringing down that plane. And so that's why the French want him. They want him to go to prison in France for that.
The gentleman.
Thank you. My name is Harry Wynne-Williams. You're very clear that there was a revolution, but what about sort of from here on? Do you think there's a democratic transition that can keep pace and that's sufficiently robust and that can bridge the secular and the Islamist and all of that? How do you feel looking ahead?
Well, I think that anyone who thinks that you can go from 42 years of dictatorship to democracy overnight is dreaming. So I think it's an extremely rocky path ahead. And I think that the beginning of each chapter, I have bits of poetry and so on, and I have a bit of W.H. Auden in front of the last chapter, and it is, they wept and quarrelled, freedom was so wild. And I think that's exactly what it is, and I think that there's a lot more weeping and quarrelling to go through. So I'm not expecting democracy if they have their first elections in June. I think we've got a long way to go.
One of the quotations that you also put in your book was one by Gaddafi, which is in the very first chapter, when he said, I shall die as a martyr at the end.
Oh, yes.
Did you think twice about putting this in the beginning of your book?
No. Why should I think twice about it? I thought it was brilliant.
Because the way that he was killed actually rose a lot of questions about so many values.
Of course it does. And I mean, the way he was killed was utterly savage and brutal, and absolutely appalling and horrific. And I'm not at all surprised, because basically the guys who killed him, there was no command structure. There was no knowledge of the Geneva Conventions. I mean, these were guys who they'd been fighting for 6 months, and they were exhausted, and they were wild with anger and the desire for revenge, and there was absolutely no structure in place to stop them doing something like that. So I'm not the slightest bit surprised that that's what happened. Doesn't excuse it or mean that it's all right. It was the most appalling and savage act.
You did say in your book that so many people tried to show you the video, as if if they show you the video, it's going to be real. You're going to believe them.
And there was a lot of stuff that I felt that Gaddafi's sort of in people, inside people. You can't live under that kind of system without being changed or affected. And I felt that people sort of couldn't quite believe that he was really gone for a long time. And I don't know what it's like now. It's like they had to keep... They wanted to constantly show me this video and so on. Like, he's really gone. He's really gone. Look. This is the proof. He's really gone. He's really gone. I was going, no, I really don't want to see that. But it's really nasty. And that was the whole thing about his body being laid out in that supermarket in Misrata. Now, for me, that was really ghoulish, that this rotting corpse is laid out there. But I did understand that for Libyans, it's really important. It is really important to see that he was dead. And because this is the modern world, to film it on their iPhones. I mean, this is the most mobile phone recorded revolution ever. But that's become kind of part of how you prove that something's real.
Questions, lady?
Wait, the microphone's coming.
Karen Dabrowska. So from your comments, it seems that you don't have much hope for this coming election with 80 political associations and 120 independent candidates.
No, well, there you are. 80 political associations, 120.
Let me add to this, no constitution yet.
And a rather sort of dodgy electoral law, yes?
So do you think this democracy is a joke and really power is somewhere else?
No, the problem with Libya is that power is nowhere at the moment. And that's what's so complicated about it. Power is everywhere and nowhere. Power is to some extent with the militias because they're the ones who won the revolution, or they see they won the revolution, and they have guns. Power is to some extent with the National Transitional Council because they are the ones who are officially in charge. But they're a bunch of academics mainly, and a lot of them are exiles, haven't been there for a long time. And then, and then obviously you've been discussing power to some extent with the oil companies and the outside countries which intervene. So power is diffused all over, and that is what the complicated thing about Libya is now, and that's and because there are no strong Libyan institutions, and as yet no strong political characters. And also I think that Libyans are allergic to strong political characters after Gaddafi. They don't want someone coming up who's going to be a strong man. That's the last thing they want. And so that's why that's why it's complicated. I don't think it means it's going to be a disaster, and I'm not a Cassandra saying that everything's doomed. This is a small country of 6 million people who are very well educated with a lot of oil and gas and money. They should be able to do it. But these are some of the factors which are working against them. And the stuff in the head, I spoke to a young woman who I quote, who said to me, one of our problems is that we've all got a little Gaddafi in our heads. And by that, what she meant was, people turn to violence very quickly as a way of solving disputes. There's no tradition, no political tradition of negotiating and compromising and so on. So all of that stuff has to be learned. It's not easy.
The lady, please. And then a gentleman afterwards, by the way. Any gentleman.
This is obviously about Syria, but you did mention Egypt earlier, and I just wondered what you thought about where things are at in Egypt at the moment.
Well, I'm certainly not an expert on Egypt, and I haven't been there since I was there, when Mubarak fell and so on. But I mean, at the time, I remember saying, in Tahrir Square that night, rarely has a military coup been greeted with such enthusiasm. I think in Egypt it's very difficult because they have the opposite of Libya in the sense that they have this huge sclerotic bureaucracy, and they have incredibly, in a sense, they're strong institutions. Maybe strong is the wrong word, but I mean they have institutions which are so established, and bureaucrats who the idea of changing the way they do things. I mean, you should ask her, not me. She's Egyptian. The way they do things is so incredibly difficult and complicated. And they've got 80 million people and huge amounts of poverty. Libya's easy compared to
Since
Egypt.
you mentioned that I'm Egyptian,
yes.
There is actually something that's, I don't know if it's funny or not, but there is one phrase that you quoted Sunday. Libyan youth saying, "Walk like an Egyptian, fight like a Libyan."
That's right.
What was that?
Well, that was, remember that pop song, "Walk Like an Egyptian"? That's what.
And it stops here. It should be a full stop here.
Yeah, no, but that's what they kept saying to me.
All right.
That's when they were trying to tell me they were great fighters. They say, everyone says, "Walk like an Egyptian, fight like a Libyan." Fight like a Libyan, you never get anywhere. Oh, sorry, I should have said that.
Hey, the gentleman at the very back, please.
Angus, who was in Benghazi at the same time as me, with Rogers.
Yeah, and congratulations on a great book, Lindsey. In some ways, the Libya war for journalists and foreign correspondents was a good war with some tragic exceptions, but it was easy, cut and dried at the end. And now we get into Bahrain and Syria, etc., which are a lot more complicated. And I was just wondering what you thought about the way they were being covered. And I think Bahrain in the last week was particularly interesting. It started off as a sports story before people, started getting wise to it. And then also Syria, which already has its own history for foreign correspondence. But if it loses that, it is losing that place on the front page. What can the media do? What should they be doing? Can they cover it better? And how much is it completely out of our hands?
Well, it's really, I think this is the huge problem that we face this year because, last year was such an amazing year to be a journalist, and we all haired around like lunatics and, and went everywhere and had a hell of a good time. And now this year, it's really difficult. And I think that Syria is the most difficult story I think we've had in a very long time. And it's very difficult to get a visa. I'm constantly trying to get a visa to go to Damascus, and I don't get one. And some people get them, and other people don't get them. We have some hope with the UN monitors going in that maybe more of us will be able to get visas. Then there's the issue of sneaking over the border. Well, Paul Conroy, who was Marie Colvin's photographer, is here with us tonight, so we all know the price that's paid. People who are brave enough to try and do that, and I'm not brave enough to try and do that. I can't do that. We all have a danger threshold, and that's beyond mine. So, and I've decided not to feel guilty about that. I've decided that that's the way it is. I know I can't do it. But where does that leave us? And it leaves us very dependent on the citizen journalists, and we've had a lot of discussions in this club about the role of citizen journalists. And we have more and more sophisticated ways of evaluating video as it comes in and checking it and verifying it and so on, but it's still not the same as being an eyewitness. And the problem with Syria is, as I think many people found when they covered the Balkans, I mean, it goes on and on and on and on, and it's going to go on. There's going to be a war in Syria for a long time, and it's going to go up and down, and on the front page and the top of the news and down again. It's not going to be short and sharp. Libya was a story which, fitted in our news cycle. After 4 months, everybody was complaining, oh, God, isn't it, it's a stalemate. It's never going to be over. You think, well, how long did the French Revolution take? How long did the Russian Revolution take? We're so impatient these days. We want everything to be sorted, before we get bored. Syria's going to be long and complicated. And Bahrain, I mean, people have... In a sense, with Bahrain, it's not so much the coverage; it's the issue itself. It's the suppression that's going on, and I don't see that as a story that's going to be sorted soon. But I also don't see it as a story that's going to change soon, and that's a particular challenge for journalists, because if the story doesn't change, it carries on being the same. How do you find new ways of telling it? Or how often can you tell your editor, "I want to do the same story again"? It's difficult.
Well, actually, thanks for asking a question about the coverage, because I know about this as well. You can sometimes receive accusations from both sides, to be frank. And with Bahrain, it's very difficult because it has a sectarian background, and some people look at the revolution in Bahrain as a one derived by Iran. Yeah. Back to your book about Libya and the coverage. Did you actually rely on some of the information in the book about the UGC, the user generated content, taken information or primary information from people and then go and follow it?
Less so. I mean, at the very beginning, yes. Because some of the first images which came out of Libya were from Tobruk. Because in every town in Libya you had these very ugly statues of the Green Book, Gaddafi's Green Book, these sort of concrete green painted things with white lettering on. And one of the first things that people did in the revolution was they took pickaxes and shovels and whatever they had and destroyed them. And some of those pictures came out from Tobruk, and that was pretty like, whoa, this is something really big to destroy the Green Book. And one of the stories in the book is about a guy called Tawfiq from Tobruk, who was one of the people who filmed that, and then locked himself into the one internet cafe in Tobruk for 11 hours. And the line goes up and the line goes down to get these pictures out. And then eventually the line is cut, and it's cut for the next 6 months. But by then... It's very symbolic. Exactly. Yeah, quite right. It's like Saddam Hussein's statue is the Green Book coming down. But Tawfiq did an amazing thing, which was that when he put this up on his Facebook page, he said, "This is my phone number, and please will somebody get this stuff onto Al Jazeera and onto YouTube and call me if you're interested in revolution in Libya." Whoa. And then he went home and he said to his father, because he told his father what he'd done, his father said, "You did what?" And he said, "If you ride the camel, you can't keep your head down." Which apparently I'm told is a Libyan saying. And Tawfiq was one of our first contacts when we went in, because Tawfiq became a sort of one-man journalist fixer organization, helping people getting in. And then we stayed with him in his family home. He got the New York Times in, and he got CNN in, and Tawfiq's just he was wonderful. I think so many of my favourite lines from Tawfiq is a very, very earnest young man in a duffel coat, and a couple of things he kept saying to me, "You must meet my brother-in-law. You'd so like my brother-in-law." And I say, "Tell me about your brother-in-law." He said, "You must meet my brother-in-law. He's awesome in quantum physics." And then the other line, which I loved from Tawfiq, was, because Tawfiq's English was really, really good, but you know how sometimes when somebody's English is really, really good, but not quite. And we went to stay with another guy in Benghazi when we first got in, and Tawfiq came with us. And Tawfiq really liked this guy, and this guy had participated in the revolution and so on. And he looked at me and he said, "From the vagina of revolution, true heroes are born." I didn't have the heart to say that isn't quite how we might put it.
Right. Questions, please. The lady, please, over there.
I'm giving away all my best lines. No one's going to buy the book because I've told all the jokes.
Thank you so much for the timing. Go ahead.
Hi, Ayatum Nena from Shabab Libya, the Libyan youth movement.
Oh, right, yes.
And I just was wondering what your impressions were of the youth in Libya being 60% of the population. And even across the Arab Spring, it was known that youth were very much those that took to the streets. So what were your impressions, and what do you think Libyan youth will, what role they'll play in the rebuilding of Libya?
Well, I think that the youth, I mean, obviously the youth were absolutely critical. I mean, the youth were the leaders. The youth were the ones who made this thing happen. And so they're extremely important. And then one of the difficulties in Libya is that what you now have is a bunch of old men who are now running things in the NTC. And that's something that the youth have to do. And I think that probably it's difficult. I can't see, if you're very young, it's kind of hard to immediately go into government. So maybe one of the main roles for the youth will be in civil society. But I think that, it is going to be very important for the youth to try, if what you want is democracy and so on, to work for that, because you're the ones who are going to have to make this happen. And one of the problems about Libya at the moment is every time anybody wants something, they think what you do is protest, as opposed to building things. Because before you never could build things, and now you can protest, and it's fun. And maybe the time for protesting has gone. Maybe it's time to actually do stuff.
The question is not only about Libya, actually. It's about most of the Arab Spring countries, if not all. People are talking about that youth were actually the first spark of all the Arab Spring revolutions.
Absolutely, they were.
Who cultivated it, absolutely, in politics field are not the youth.
No, that's absolutely true. But and it's very interesting because I met an older guy in Misrata with his sons, and he said, if we would never have done anything, we the older generation, because we knew it was impossible to do anything, to change anything. And it was only the youth who were too stupid to know, too ignorant. If it hadn't been for that stupidity and ignorance, nothing would ever have changed.
I'll have one more question, please, before we finish all this. The gentleman here, please. And I'm really sorry for everybody else.
Well, just some impacts on British politics. People, it's well known about Gaddafi's funding the IRA. Of course, what's less well known, the 1980s, Gaddafi rather bizarrely funded at the same time the National Front and the Workers' Revolutionary Party.
Certainly did.
I mean, it's just
Jerry Healy
and the National Front on the other side. So just interested in your comments. This rather bizarre funding process.
Gaddafi would fund absolutely anything which he thought would overthrow Western powers, and he funded. I mean, it's hard to find a group in the world that he didn't fund at one point. Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines. Thank you. He funded Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines, definitely. He funded. Who were the people? The Japanese who did the Lord Airport. Red Army, Japanese Red Army. And yeah, the Workers' Revolutionary Party here, he was sort of under the belief that, I don't know, Vanessa Redgrave was going to end up as Prime Minister or something. And Nick Griffin. And then I didn't know that he funded the National Front as well. It doesn't surprise me. He funded the Nation of Islam in the US. He would fund anybody,
arguably,
yeah, if he thought that they might bring down what he saw as his enemies, which were, the Americans, the British, and so on. So there was no sort of intellectual or ideological consistency to it. It was just the consistency was about, will you do something which will upset or bring down the regimes that I am against, and that was it, really.
And when will you write your next book?
Sometime.
Should say now. What would you write about if you start your new book now?
That's a
secret.
secret.
All
That's
right.
a secret.
We'll wait for this then. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much.